Let's take a look at structured versus unstructured interviews. Most interviews vary in the degree to which the interviewer structures the interview process. In unstructured or non-directive interviews, the manager follows no set format. Typical questions might include, for instance, tell me about yourself. Why do you think you'd be good for a job here? And what would you say are your main strengths and weaknesses? In a structured or directive interview, the employer lists questions ahead of time. The interviewer follows a printed form to ask a series of questions, such as how was the person's present job obtained? Comments printed beneath the questions then guide the interviewer in evaluating answers. But in practice, interview structure is a matter of degree. Sometimes the manager might just want to ensure they have a list of questions to ask so as to avoid skipping any questions. Here, they might choose a list of questions first. Structured interviews are generally best. In such interviews, all interviews are generally asked the same questions. Partly because of this, these interviews tend to be more consistent, reliable, and valid. Standardizing the interview also enhances job relatedness, reduces overall subjectivity, and thus the potential for bias, and may even enhance the ability to withstand legal challenge. However, blindly following a structured format may not provide enough opportunity to pursue points of interest. The interviewer should always be able to ask follow-up questions as they develop. We can classify interviews based on the content or the types of questions asked. Many interviewers ask relatively unfocused questions such as, what will you be doing in 5 years? Questions like these usually don't provide much insight into how the person will do on the job. That's why situational, behavioral, and job-related questions are best. In a situational interview, you ask the candidate what their behavior would be in a given situation. For example, ask a supervisory candidate how they would act in response to a subordinate coming to work 3 days late in a row. Whereas situational interviews ask applicants to describe how they would react in a hypothetical situation today or tomorrow, behavioral interviews ask applicants to describe how they reacted to actual situations in the past. Situational questions start with phrases such as, suppose you were faced with the following, or what would you do if? Behavioral questions with phrases like, can you think of a time when, or what did you do when? Behavioral interviews are becoming increasingly popular and provide the basis for the best selection decisions in today's predominantly interview-based selection procedures. That's because past performance is the best predictor we have of future performance. Interviews happen in a variety of ways. In a sequential interview, several persons interview the applicant in sequence one-on-one and then make their hiring decision. In an unstructured sequential interview, each interviewer generally asks questions that come to their mind. In a structured sequential interview, each interviewer rates the candidates on a standard evaluation form using standardized questions. A panel interview, also known as a board interview, is an interview conducted by a team of interviewers, usually 2 or 3, who question each candidate and then combine their ratings of each candidate's answers into a final panel score. This contrasts with the one-on-one interview in which the interview meets one candidate at a time and a serial interview where several interviewers assess a single candidate one-on-one sequentially. The panel format enables interviewers to ask follow-up questions which may elicit more meaningful responses, though some candidates find panel interviews more stressful. Whether panel interviews are more or less reliable and valid than sequential interviews depends on how the employer actually does the panel interview. For better or worse, some employers conduct interviews like speed dating. Interviewers tend to jump to conclusions about candidates during the interview. One researcher estimates that in 85% of cases, interviewers had made up their minds before the interview even began, based on first impressions gleaned from candidates' applications and personal appearance. In one study, interviewers judged candidates who they were told once suffered from depression more negatively. Even structured interviewers are usually predicated on a brief discussion, and impressions can contaminate results. First impressions are especially damaging when the prior information is negative. In one study, giving interviewers the candidate's test scores biased the candidate's ultimate assessments. And the interviewers' final decisions always reflected what they expected from the applicants based on those test scores, put aside from the applicant's actual performance in the interview itself. Interviews are more influenced by unfavorable than favorable information about the candidate, and their impressions are much more likely to change from favorable to unfavorable than from unfavorable to favorable. For the interviewee who starts out poorly, it's difficult to overcome a bad first impression. Interviewers often make their decisions based on incorrect stereotypes. They then erroneously match interviewees with their incorrect stereotypes. You should clarify what sorts of traits you're looking for and why before starting an interview. One classic study involved 30 professional interviewers. Half got just a brief description and half got a much more explicit job description and information. More job knowledge translated into better interviews. Candidate order error means that the order you see applicants affects how you rate them. In one study, managers had to evaluate a sample candidate who was just average after first evaluating several unfavorable candidates. They scored the average candidate more favorably than they might have otherwise. This contrast effect can be huge. In some early studies, evaluators based only a small part of the applicant's rating on their actual potential. Pressure to hire accentuates this problem. Researchers told one group of managers to assume that they were behind in their recruiting quota. They told the second group that they were ahead. Those behind rated the same recruits far more highly. The applicant's nonverbal behavior can affect their rating. In one study, human resource specialists watched videotape job interviews in which the applicant's verbal content was identical, but their nonverbal behavior differed markedly. Researchers told applicants in one group to exhibit minimal eye contact, a low energy level, and low voice modulation. Those in a second group demonstrated the opposite behavior. 23 of 26 personnel specialists who saw the high eye contact, high energy candidate would have invited them for a second interview. None who saw the other candidate would have recommended a second interview. Nonverbal behaviors are probably so important because interviewers infer your personality from how you behave in the interview. Extroverted applicants seem particularly prone to self-promotion, and self-promotion is strongly related to the interviewer's perception of a candidate job fit. One study found that some used ingratiation to persuade interviewers to like them. For instance, the candidates praised the interviewers or appeared to agree with their opinions, thus signaling they shared similar beliefs. Others make self-promoting comments about their accomplishments. Psychologists call using techniques like ingratiation and self-promotion impression management. Most interviewers aren't likely to know they're being misled. Self-promotion can be an effective tactic, but faking or lying generally backfires in the process. Unfortunately, physical attributes distort assessments in interviews and other selection methods. For example, people usually ascribe more favorable traits and more successful life outcomes to attractive people. Similarly, race can play a role, depending on how you conduct the interview. In one study, the white members of a racially balanced interview panel rated white candidates higher, while the black interviewers rated black candidates higher. But in all cases, structured interviews produced less of a difference between minority and white interviewers than did unstructured ones. The EEOC says testers are individuals who apply for employment which they don't intend to accept for the sole purpose of uncovering unlawful discriminatory hiring practices. The possibility of testers makes non-discrimination interviewing even more important. Although not really seeking employment, testers have the legal standing with the courts and the EEOC. One civil rights group sent 4 university students, 2 white, 2 black, to an employment agency, supposedly in pursuit of a job. They gave 4 testers backgrounds to make their qualifications appear almost identical. The white testers got interviews and job offers. The black testers got neither. The list of ways in which interviewers themselves wreck interviews is boundless. For example, some interviewers inadvertently telegraph the expected answers, as in, this job involves a lot of stress. Can you handle that, can't you? Even subtle clues like a smile or a nod can telegraph the desired answer. Some interviewers talk so much that applicants can't answer questions. At the other extreme, some interviewers let the applicant dominate the interview. When interviewers have a favorable pre-interview impression of the applicant, they tend to act more positively towards that person, smiling more as an example. Other interviewers play interrogator, gleefully pouncing on inconsistencies. Some interviewers play amateur psychologist, unprofessionally probing for hidden meanings in what the applicant says. There are many errors that interviewers make, including first impressions, not clarifying what the job involves or requires, nonverbal behavior, interviewees' personal characteristics, or interviewers' inadvertent behavior. Interviewer behavior matters. There's little doubt that the structured, situational interview produces superior results. First, we analyze the job. We write a job description including a list of job duties, required knowledge, skills, and abilities, and other qualifications. Then we rate the job's main duties. We rate each job duty, say from 1 to 5, based on how important it is to the job. Then we create interview questions. These are situational, behavioral, and job knowledge questions for each job duty, with more questions for the important ones. Then we create benchmark answers. Next, for each question, we develop these benchmark or ideal answers where a good rating has a 5, a marginal rating has a 3, and a poor rating has a 1. Then we appoint an interview panel and conduct the interviews. Employers generally conduct structured, situational interviews using a panel rather than one-on-one. Panels usually consist of 2 or 3 members, preferably those who wrote the questions and answers. They may also include the job's supervisor and/or incumbent and an HR representative. The panel members review the job description, questions, and benchmark answers before the interview. One panel member introduces the applicant and asks all questions to ensure consistency. However, all panel members record and rate the applicant's answers on a rating sheet by indicating where the candidate's answer to each question falls relative to the benchmark poor, marginal, or good answers. At the end of the interview, someone answers any questions that the applicant might have. We've seen that many organizations use competency models or profiles for recruiting, selecting, training, appraising, and compensating employees. Employers can use such a profile for formulating job-related interview questions.